The snow was relentless. It fell heavy and silent, wrapping the world outside in a cold, suffocating stillness. I watched it pile higher against the windows of Clark's house, my mug of cocoa growing cold in my hands. I didn't plan to be here, not like this, not snowed in and stuck. I'd come to drop off a gift for Selah. She wasn't even here, off visiting her parents for the week. Now I was stuck in this house with him. Clark. I shouldn't be here. I should have left hours ago, before the roads got too bad. But the snow started falling fast, and by the time I realized how bad it was, I couldn't leave. You're staying, Clark had said, like there was no room for argument. And maybe there wasn't. I told myself it was fine, just one night. No big deal. But now I'm here, curled up on his couch, with nowhere else to go. Before we begin, I want to warn you that this story contains mature themes. It deals with the challenges of new motherhood, family relationships, and infidelity. If these topics make you uncomfortable, you might want to stop watching now. I took a sip of the cocoa. It had gone lukewarm, but I drank it anyway, letting the sweetness coat my tongue. The fire crackled in front of me, its warmth seeping into the room. Everything felt too quiet. Too still. The snowstorm outside had muffled everything, even my own thoughts. He walked back into the room then, carrying a tray with a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He was smiling, that easy, disarming grin he always had. Figured we could use a drink, he said, setting it down on the table. I didn't answer. I just watched him pour the amber liquid into the glasses. His hands were steady, his movements casual, like this was just another night. Just 2 people stuck inside, waiting out a storm. But it wasn't. It never was. I tried to ignore the way my stomach twisted when our fingers brushed as he handed me a glass. Thanks, I muttered, taking it. The whiskey burned my throat, sharp and strong. It's not so bad, right? He said, settling into the armchair across from me. A little snow, a little whiskey, good company. Could be worse. I smiled at that, even though I didn't mean to. He always had a way of pulling reactions out of me that I didn't want to give. The room felt too warm, but I couldn't tell if it was the fire or him. I kept thinking about Selah, her framed pictures on the mantel, her laugh that filled this house on better days. She'd always been kind to me. Too kind. I shouldn't be here. But I didn't leave. I just sat there, drinking and pretending this was normal. Do you remember the lake house? He asked suddenly. I froze. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Yeah, I said, keeping my voice light, casual. You and Timothy wouldn't stop trying to throw me in the water. He laughed at that, the sound low and warm. It made my chest ache. Those were good times, he said. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because the lake house wasn't simple. It wasn't carefree or innocent. Not for me. I tried to focus on the snow outside, on the way it blurred the world into a soft, white haze. But his voice pulled me back every time. The fire popped, breaking the silence, and I startled. You okay? He asked, his eyes on me now. Yeah, I lied. But I wasn't. I wasn't okay. Not here, not with him. The glass in my hand was empty now, but I didn't remember finishing it. He poured me another without asking. I didn't stop him. This storm doesn't look like it's letting up anytime soon, he said, leaning back in his chair. No, I said. My voice was barely above a whisper. I looked at him then, really looked at him. The firelight softened the angles of his face, made him look younger. For a moment, I let myself remember how it used to feel, before everything got so complicated. I shouldn't be here. But I stayed anyway. If you're still with me, don't forget to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this. Trust me. There's so much more to uncover. The storm showed no mercy. By now, the snow was piled halfway up the windows, and the wind howled like a restless spirit outside. I stared at it for what felt like hours, hoping to see some sign that it might let up. It didn't. Clark had been pacing earlier, checking his phone, watching the news. Nothing. No way out. "We're not going anywhere tonight," he said finally, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a finality to it that sent a ripple through me. I wasn't sure why it felt so heavy. It was just snow. But it wasn't just the storm keeping us here. It was something else, something neither of us wanted to name. I nodded and tried to sound casual. "Guess we're stuck." "Guess so," he replied, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. His gaze lingered, and I felt that old, familiar pull. I forced myself to look away. We'd been killing time in small, meaningless ways. A board game neither of us cared about. Flipping through TV channels we weren't watching. The kind of things people do when they're trying not to think too hard about what's in the room with them. "You know," he said, his tone lighter, "snowstorms always seem to bring out the worst in me." I raised an eyebrow, smirking despite myself. "The worst? Or the best, depending on how you look at it," he added with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. There it was. That edge in his voice, that line he was walking. I felt it too. It was like a weight pressing on my chest, a tension that had been building since the moment I'd walked through the door. I should have said something, shut it down. But I didn't. We ended up playing cards at the coffee table, the fire crackling behind us. At first, it was easy, normal, just another game, another way to pass the time. But then there were the glances. The way his hand would brush mine when he reached for the deck. The way he'd lean closer when he spoke, his voice dropping just enough to make my pulse quicken. I laughed at something he said, something stupid, I'm sure, and realized too late how close he was. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He didn't move, just watched me with those eyes that always seemed to see too much. "Promise," he said softly. My name sounded different coming from him. I pulled back, clearing my throat. "Your deal." He didn't argue, just picked up the cards. But the air between us was charged now, humming with everything we weren't saying. It wasn't just guilt that clawed at me, it was the memories. They came rushing back, uninvited. That summer at the lake house, the stolen moments that should have stayed buried. The way he'd looked at me back then, like I was the only person in the world who mattered. I thought I'd locked all of that away, but being here with him made it impossible to ignore. I told myself to stop. To think of Selah, of what this would do to her if she ever found out. But the more I tried to focus on her, the more I thought of Clark. "This is dangerous," I muttered under my breath, more to myself than to him. He looked up from the cards, his brow furrowed. "What is?" "Being here," I said, forcing a laugh to cover the crack in my voice. "This storm. It's too much." For a moment, I thought he was going to push. Instead, he set the cards down and leaned back, his gaze never leaving mine. "You ever feel like," he paused, searching for the right words. "Like no matter what you do, it's not enough? Like there's something missing, and you don't even know what it is?" His words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. "Yeah," I said quietly. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I love Selah, you know? She's amazing." But sometimes, he trailed off, and I felt my chest tighten. I should have stopped him. I should have told him not to say it. "Sometimes it feels like she doesn't see me," he said finally. "Not the real me." I didn't trust myself to speak, so I just nodded. "But you always have," he added, his voice barely above a whisper. My heart was pounding now, so loud I was sure he could hear it. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that I wasn't any better, that this wasn't right. But the words wouldn't come. The storm outside raged on, but the silence in the room was deafening. The fire had burned down to embers, its warmth fading but still enough to fill the room with a soft, orange glow. I sat on the couch, my legs tucked under me, staring at the dying flames. Clark was in the chair across from me, quiet for once. His glass of whiskey was untouched on the table, forgotten. The storm outside had swallowed the world, erasing everything beyond these walls. I should have been comforted by the thought of this house being a safe haven. Instead, it felt like a trap. Clark broke the silence first. It's strange, isn't it? How something as simple as snow can shut everything down. It's like the world just stops. I nodded but didn't answer. My thoughts were tangled, a mess of guilt and longing and everything I didn't want to face. It kind of feels like a reset, he added, his voice softer now. I glanced at him, meeting his eyes for just a moment too long. A reset, I repeated, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Promise, can I ask you something? I hesitated, then nodded. Do you ever think about what might have been? If things had gone differently? My heart stopped for a beat. He wasn't asking about the weather or the snowstorm or even Selah. He was asking about us, about the past we'd buried but never really let go of. I tried to deflect. It doesn't matter now. We made our choices. Yeah, we did, he said, but there was something in his voice, regret, maybe, or doubt. But that doesn't mean I don't think about it. I stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Part of me wanted to tell him to stop, to change the subject, to let this moment pass. But another part of me, the part one tried so hard to ignore, wanted to hear more. You shouldn't say things like that, I said finally, though my voice was barely a whisper. Why not? It's just the truth. I didn't have an answer for that. The silence stretched on, heavy and charged. I could feel his eyes on me, but I couldn't bring myself to look at him again. It doesn't have to mean anything, he said after a while. It's just, sometimes I think about how different things could have been. If we hadn't been so careful, so afraid of what everyone else would think. I laughed then, but it came out sharp and bitter. Careful? Clark, we weren't careful. We were reckless. We just got lucky no one found out. Maybe, he admitted, leaning back in his chair. But does that mean we have to keep pretending it didn't happen? Like it didn't mean anything? I set my glass down, my hands trembling. Stop. Please. Why, he pressed. Why do we always have to act like this isn't real? Like you don't feel it too? I looked at him then, really looked at him. His face was open, vulnerable in a way I wasn't used to seeing. It scared me. Because it's not just about us, I said. It's about Selah. And everything else. It's not that simple. Nothing ever is, he said, his voice low. But that doesn't mean it's not real. The room felt impossibly small. The storm outside roared, but it might as well have been silent for all I could hear. My chest was tight, my breathing shallow. I can't do this, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. Yes, you can, he said, standing and crossing the room to sit beside me. He was too close now, his knee brushing mine, his warmth overwhelming. We already are. He reached out, his hand hovering near mine. I could have pulled away. I should have. But I didn't. When it happened, it wasn't planned. It wasn't even deliberate. It was a moment, a single, fragile moment where everything we'd been holding back came rushing to the surface. He kissed me first, his lips hesitant but insistent. I froze at first, my mind screaming at me to stop, to push him away. But then my body betrayed me, leaning into him, my hands finding his shoulders, his neck. It was like something inside me broke loose, a dam giving way after years of pressure. When it was over, I couldn't move. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing and my mind spinning. What have I done? Clark was quiet beside me, his breathing even, almost calm. He didn't look at me, didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, he spoke. It doesn't have to change anything. I turned to him, my stomach twisting. How can you say that? Because it's true, he said simply. It was just a moment. That's all. But it wasn't. It never was. I sat up, pulling the blanket around me. This was a mistake. It doesn't have to be, he said, his voice steady. It doesn't have to mean anything more than what it was. But it did. And we both knew it. The room was quieter now. The fire had burned out completely, leaving only a faint chill in the air. I sat at the edge of the couch, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Clark was sprawled in the armchair, a fresh drink in his hand, looking far too comfortable for someone who had just upended everything. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. The way it happened. The way I'd let it happen. It wasn't just the act itself, it was the silence that followed. The way he acted like it was no big deal. So, he said suddenly, breaking the stillness. You know who'd be laughing their ass off at this right now? I didn't answer, my jaw tightening as I stared at the floor. Timothy, he said with a chuckle, leaning back in his chair. He'd get a real kick out of this. I froze at the mention of his brother's name. Timothy Rosa's. The name felt like a punch to the gut, dragging up memories I'd spent years trying to forget. Don't, I said quietly, but Clark wasn't listening. He leaned forward, his grin widening. Come on, promise. You remember the lake house? The three of us? That summer? I turned to glare at him, my voice sharp. Stop it, Clark. He raised his hands in mock surrender. What? It's just a memory. A good one, if I recall. It wasn't just a memory. It was the beginning of everything, of all the mistakes I kept making, the lines I kept crossing. Clark reached for his phone, still grinning. I should call him. See how he's holding up in this storm. I stared at him, my stomach nodding. Why? Why not? He's probably bored out of his mind, same as us. Besides, he trailed off, smirking. He'd love to hear about this little situation we're in. I grabbed his wrist before he could dial. Don't. But he ignored me, pulling his hand free and hitting the call button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before Timothy's voice came through, muffled but familiar. Clark? Tim. You snowed in too? Clark said, his tone far too casual. Yeah, been stuck since yesterday. Why? You two stuck together over there? Timothy's voice was light, but I could hear the curiosity behind it. Yup, Clark said, glancing at me with a knowing smirk. Just me and Promise, waiting out the storm. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. My fists clenched, my nails digging into my palms. Timothy laughed on the other end. That sounds cozy. You two behaving yourselves? Clark's grin widened. What do you think? I wanted to scream, to grab the phone and end the call, but I couldn't move. My throat felt tight, my heart pounding in my chest. Too bad you're not closer, Clark continued. Could have made this a real reunion. Timothy laughed again, but it was forced. Yeah, well, I'm not walking through a snowstorm just to hang out with you two. The call ended shortly after that, but the damage was already done. Clark set the phone down, leaning back in his chair with a satisfied sigh. See? He's fine. I stared at him, my voice trembling. What the hell was that? What? He said, raising an eyebrow. It was just a joke. No, it wasn't, I snapped. You're dragging him into this, into us. Why? He shrugged, his expression infuriatingly calm. Because it's part of the story, isn't it? Part of who we are. I shook my head, my chest tightening. It's not part of anything. It's over. It's supposed to be over. Is it? He asked, his tone softening. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The silence between us stretched on, heavy and suffocating. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in. The weight of what we'd done pressed down on me, harder and harder, until I thought I might break. Clark, meanwhile, looked perfectly at ease. He sipped his drink, his eyes half closed, like he didn't have a care in the world. "How can you be so calm?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "Do you even care what this means?" He opened one eye, glancing at me. "What do you want me to do, promise? Freak out? Cry? It won't change anything." "That's not the point," I said, my voice rising. "You're acting like this doesn't matter. Like it was nothing." He sighed, setting his glass down. "It's not that it doesn't matter. It's just, what's the point of overthinking it? We're adults. We made a choice. It's done. Is that all it is to you? A choice?" He didn't answer, but his silence said enough. I felt the tears welling up, but I refused to let them fall. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "I can't do this," I said, standing abruptly. "I can't sit here and pretend like this is normal. Like it doesn't change everything. Promise." "No," I cut him off, grabbing my coat. "I need air." The snow was still falling, heavy and cold, as I stepped outside. It didn't matter. I needed the space. I needed to breathe. But even out there, in the freezing wind, I couldn't escape him, or myself. The cold air bit at my skin as I stood on the porch, staring out at the endless white expanse of snow. My breath came in sharp bursts, each exhale visible in the icy air. I hadn't bothered to grab boots, so the thin soles of my socks were soaked through, but I couldn't feel it. I couldn't feel anything except the ache in my chest and the gnawing question in my mind. What did this mean? The door creaked open behind me, and I didn't have to turn around to know it was Clark. He stood there for a moment before stepping out into the cold, his voice low. "Promise, come inside. You'll freeze out here." I didn't move. "Why do you care?" He sighed, and I heard the crunch of snow as he walked closer. "Of course I care. Don't do this." I turned to face him then, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. "Do what, Clark? Ask questions you don't want to answer?" He looked at me, his jaw tightening. "You're upset. I get it." "No, you don't," I snapped. "You're acting like this was nothing. Like it doesn't mean anything. And maybe it doesn't, to you. But I need to know. I need to hear you say it." He hesitated, his eyes flickering away from mine. "It's not that simple, promise." "Yes, it is." My voice cracked, but I didn't care. Did this mean anything to you? Or was it just, what? A distraction? A way to pass the time? "It's not like that," he said, but his words felt hollow. "Then what is it like?" I pressed, stepping closer. "Tell me, Clark. Tell me what this was. Because I'm standing here, falling apart, and you're fine. Like none of this matters." He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "I don't know, okay? I don't know what to tell you. I didn't plan this. I didn't mean for it to happen." "That's not an answer," I said, my voice quieter now. He looked at me then, his eyes softening. "It meant something." "Of course, it did. But what do you want me to say? That it changes everything? That it doesn't?" I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "I don't know. I don't know what I want you to say. I can't keep pretending this didn't happen." "Then don't," he said, his voice firm. "But what's the alternative, promise? Telling Selah? Blowing up everything? What does that solve?" His words hit like a slap, and I stepped back, my chest tight. He wasn't wrong. But it didn't make it hurt any less. Later, I sat alone in the guest room, the faint hum of the heater the only sound. The snow outside had slowed to a soft, steady fall, and the world felt impossibly still. I thought of Selah. Her laugh, her kindness, the way she always made me feel welcome. I thought of Clark, his charm, his easy confidence that always seemed to draw me in, no matter how hard I tried to resist. And I thought of myself. Of the choices I'd made, the lines I'd crossed. When did it start? Not just tonight, but years ago. The first time Clark kissed me, the first time I let him. I told myself it didn't mean anything back then, that it was a mistake I'd never make again. But it wasn't just one mistake. It was a pattern. A cycle I didn't know how to break. I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts swirling. What did it say about me, that I kept ending up here? That I couldn't walk away, even when I knew I should? The snow outside reminded me of the lake house, the way it covered everything, made the world feel clean and new. But snow didn't erase what was underneath. It just hid it for a while. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun was out, bright and blinding against the snow, and the roads were starting to clear. I stood in the kitchen, staring out the window, a cup of coffee cooling in my hands. Clark came in, his footsteps quiet. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Sella's coming back tomorrow," he said finally, his voice careful. I nodded. "Good. She'll be glad to see you." He leaned against the counter, watching me. "We should talk about last night." I shook my head. "No. We shouldn't." "Promise, no," I said firmly, turning to face him. "It doesn't matter what we say. What's done is done." He looked at me for a long time before nodding. "Okay." We didn't speak again after that. As I packed my things, I tried to convince myself that I could leave it behind. That I could bury this night, like all the others. But as I drove away, the snow melting under the tires, I couldn't help but feel the weight of it all. The story doesn't end here. It doesn't end at all. It just lingers, like a shadow, waiting for the next storm. Either way, I want to hear what you think. Tell me, what would you do if your world fell apart like mine did? How would you move forward? Let me know in the comments. And if this story made you feel something, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more.